May the meditations of my heart and my mind be acceptable to you, gracious and loving God. You, ever-present God, when we are busy running around for Advent, remind us to slow down. Slow us down and remind us that you are here with us. Yesterday, Kath and I actually went out yesterday. I was done with my message early. She wanted to go shopping for a couple gift cards and so forth. So we went to Target, and I was looking at these gift cards, looking for certain ones, and there was this younger fellow, which isn't hard to do, who was looking for cards too. I said, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for this, and if you tell me what you're looking for, I'll look too." He said, "It's something to do with filling a game or something or other. I don't know." And I said, "I don't even know what that is." He said, "Actually, I don't either." He said, "I'm a 90s baby." Or a 90s. I grew up in the 90s, however how he put it. And he said, change so much. I don't have any idea what this is. Now, I didn't grow up in the 90s. I grew up a few years before that. And but change is even difficult for the people who grew up in the 90s. The theme last week was hope. You heard that this morning again. The gospel reading was about the coming of the Son of Man. The church responded to this event by maintaining a sense of expectancy, even with the uncertainty. Today, our theme is peace, just peace. In our gospel reading, John the Baptizer embodies the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 40. And John's ministry includes both the proclamation and the baptism of Jesus. So one morning you're sitting at home drinking your cup of coffee, and the phone rings. It's Mrs. Smith from Pine Grove Elementary School, and she says, "I need somebody to read during story time today. The person that was supposed to do it can't do it. Would you be willing to do it?" And she says, "The story's Goldilocks." And you know Goldilocks, that's pretty easy. And you say, "Of course I will do that. Of course I'll do that." Knowing the story and knowing that she'll have a book, you didn't really think about it much. You didn't prepare it, you didn't read it. When you got to, however, she couldn't find the book. She could not find the book. But you told Mrs. Smith, "Don't worry, I know the story. I know the story. I'll just tell the story." And she says, "Okay." Now, I did forget to do something. I was going to take a volunteer to do something, but I'll do it. I apologize for that absence of my mind. So the kids gather around you and you start. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Goldilocks who was sound asleep in her bed, one that she thought was perfect for her. This morning, she opened her eyes, stretched out her arms to help herself wake up, and she sees 3 bears staring at her. In fright, still with her pajamas on, she runs out of the house into the wilderness and gets lost and has a hard time finding her way back to the underbrush and through the darkness. Now, I'm not sure which one of the kindergartners would say first, "That's not the story. That's not how it begins." That's what I was going to have somebody do for me. While they may not be able to read, they certainly have heard that story before. And they know it starts with porridge. Okay? Too hot, too cold, all that stuff. They know when you tell a story, you need to start at the beginning. And we all know that kids can be somewhat unforgiving when you change a story. Actually, sometimes kids can be pretty unforgiving. If we look at the beginning of Genesis, starting out, in the beginning, when God created the universe, we know it's the beginning. If we look at the Gospel of John, where it is written, "Before the world was created, the Word already existed. He was with God, and He was the same as God. From the very beginning, the Word was with God. We know it's the beginning of something. With God, the Gospel of Mark, it's a bit different. The writer starts with his story before we even really know what's happening. The writer begins, this is the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The writer then makes reference to the centuries-old prophecy of Isaiah. And then quickly makes reference to John, who has an interesting diet and dresses in camel hair clothing. Who says, he goes out into the world, speaking about the one who's coming after him, the one who is much greater than I himself, who wouldn't baptize with water as John did in the Jordan, but baptize with the Spirit. And we say to ourselves, this is not the beginning of Christmas. This is not the beginning of the Christmas story. This is Advent. Some would say it wasn't even fitting for the season, that Mark should go back to the angels and the shepherds and the altar, the stables and all those things that are really the good stuff. Many would say, this is not Pentecost, it is Advent. The lead up to Christmas, it's the middle of December. The writer of Mark would not be upset about those comments. He wouldn't be concerned about them at all. He was the one evangelist in the New Testament that was in a hurry. He was in a hurry to get to the story that Jesus told. There was no time to lose. The greatest story ever told needed to be told, and the writer of Mark certainly did. The writer knew that he must begin in the wilderness. He must begin in the wilderness. That we must begin with John. We must begin with getting baptized. If we are not willing to meet Jesus with repentance at hand, we might not feel the need or the motivation to meet and greet Jesus at all. Jesus came for one reason, to liberate all of us from the bondage of sin and decay. If you have no interest in seeing yourself in that light of sin and decay, seeing your own complicity and not seeing your own complicity in all of that, then you have no more use for Jesus than you do for an electrician. An electrician that shows up at your house one day and says, I'm here to fix the electrical system. And you say, there's nothing here to fix. Everything's working fine. And you send him away. You send him somewhere else. But perhaps the beginning of Mark means something else. Something very different. Perhaps it means the end of Advent. All the things that we want to have in the real beginning of the story, all the good stuff, just as the porridge was to the bears, that it's not really the core of the story at all, that it really doesn't matter. Perhaps we could even tell the Christmas story, the story of the birth of Christ, without any Bethlehem manger story. If Mark was the only gospel, a great deal would be contained would not be contained in our traditions and imagination in the month of December. It would, for the most part, disappear. However, the one thing that would not disappear is the gospel. The gospel, the good news, the core of which is recognizing as the one sent from God to save us from our sin. In God's good word, there are three other gospels of Jesus that round out the picture of Jesus, and that is good. But since two of these gospels, especially one, tell a lot about the birth of Jesus, it's fitting to celebrate his birth. I'm not saying that. But if we forget that what Mark teaches us, if we forget the core of what this is all about, then the story of this gospel story for us is no more meaningful than the bears and the porridge in the wilderness. There was a sign I saw recently. It said, if you were to put Christ back into Christmas, feed the poor, help the sick, seek justice, seek peace, be kind to all. Mark tells that he is presenting the beginning of the gospel. Some theologians might tell you that it's a little difficult to know how much is the beginning. Does it end with verse 8 and the real story of starting at verse 9, the moment Jesus appears? Or does it begin with Jesus is baptized by John? Or does the beginning go all the way through verse 13 at the end of the temptation of Jesus in the desert? Or others have suggested it ends at the end of chapter 16. That the beginning, less than the whole Gospel of Mark is the ending of the chapter where it concludes on an unfinished note. Post-resurrection silence. A silence so strong that we as the reader are forced to say, this is not the end of the story. There has to be more than this. Perhaps that is just the point. The gospel cannot end where Mark leaves it in chapter 16. There must be more. Advent is the beginning of a new church year. Everything is brought back to the beginning. The starting line, as the Son of God becomes flesh and gets born into the world. It is the one time when the rest of the world becomes vaguely familiar with our theological and spiritual location, our underpinnings. We go through all the other seasons of the world, Epiphany and Pentecost and even Eastertide, without really ever hearing in the department, we never hear in the department store a hymn during Pentecost. Okay, unless it's a Christmas hymn or in Advent. We're never going to hear anything like that specifically played for Epiphany, Pentecost, or Easter. For most people, Eastertide comes down to one day, Easter. Everybody gathers around the table and eats ham or lamb. But most people don't know the bigger story. For the most part, people have no idea what's happening in the church. None on a Sunday morning. They have no idea what it's all about. Advent is different, and while the term Advent is not part of our wider society, much of the world stops. Much of the world stops right about Thanksgiving. And it stops, only starts up again around January 1st. And the whole thing is known as Christmas. But it's not. It's Advent. Christmas is in January. People have an idea of what's happening in the church. Many will know what to do, even if they haven't been to church for years or decades. They will all feel comfortable. It will all seem familiar. The readings are the same this year as they were last year. The hymns, everything is going to be pretty much the same. And it's going to be kind of comfortable. It'll be familiar, like putting on an old sweater. With all the attention that's placed on this season, not only in the outside world, but here as well, Mark reminds us what the Christmas story is all about. It's not really the beginning of the gospel. It's only one little snippet of the gospel. The gospel that is the beginning of the story is so vast, that we will never really be able to comprehend or understand it. A voice that what the writer of Mark wants us to understand is a new creation story in parallel with the first creation story in Genesis. A voice calling out in the void to create a new world where there's hope, peace, joy,